some things, and just as a very brief highlight from that, remember that Steven Spielberg, who's a great storyteller of our day, the great director of movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark and others, in his movie Schindler's List that was black and white, he focused in on that little girl so we would know her story amidst the crowds of the Jews that were being taken to the trains and off to the camps like Auschwitz and Dachau to be exterminated. And so many of them died that way. And this little girl, he gave her a red coat. And in that black and white movie, we began to focus in. It was a technique he used to focus us in on that little girl so that we began to see things not in terms of statistics and just all these numbers to where it doesn't cause us to really focus in on an individual story, but instead he used that technique so that we would see that little girl and we would focus in. And then later in the movie, how it was that her body was one of the bodies in the trash heap of bodies that were there as she's wearing that little red coat. So one of the things I want you to do is to recognize that we're like Spielberg in a way. We're called to capture the story of another individual. And when we meet people, we hear their name. We may know that they're from a certain state or country, but that's not really knowing somebody. Until you know my story, you don't know me. Until I know your story, I don't know you. We may be acquaintances, but we don't really know each other. And so I challenge you to be those that intentionally capture a story. So in the scriptures, we're going to look at some things and then we'll go through my story. And I'll share with you a little bit about what a story looks like and train you in that way so that you will be very bold to share your story, because the Bible says that the enemy is defeated by the power of our testimony. So in Numbers, in the scriptures, we see a story of 12 spies. And I want to look at that for just a moment. It starts in the first and second verses. The Bible says, the Lord said to Moses, Numbers 13:1, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So we see here that God is saying that Moses is saying that he is raising up those who will be spies to go into the land of Canaan, which God says he is giving to the Israelites. And then let's look at the 26th verse and on. And it's once they come back from having spied out the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. So I want you to look at the story for a moment this morning in this series that I'm doing, because when we look at this, we see that these 12 spies all saw the same things with their eyes. They all saw the same circumstances. They lived through the same things. And yet, they had a different narrative. They had a different takeaway. And two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, had a difference in their story and how they conducted themselves than the 10 spies that gave the bad report. The 10 spies that gave the bad report were speaking solely to the circumstances that they saw, and they negated something that was so important. What did they negate? They negated what we read in those first 2 verses, and that's where God says, I am going to give this land to the Israelites. They ignored it. They acted as if that wasn't said. They acted as if God didn't exist. They simply gave the negative report. And Caleb rises up and he silences the negative report. And that's what we see in this story is the difference between carrying forth a God narrative and carrying forth a narrative that's solely about ourselves and our circumstances. Listen to the spies. We can't attack. They're stronger. The land devours those living in it. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Listen to what Caleb, however, says. Take possession of the land. We can certainly do it. What an absolute opposite way to interpret the very same events that they all ended up seeing and enduring. This speaks to the power of a God narrative, because what we see is Joshua and Caleb are the only ones of their generation who end up inheriting the land. All the rest of their generation don't make it to the promised land. That tells me that their narrative was unique, and their narrative had the power in it of life and death, because they were able to survive to actually go into the promised land and take that land. And that's the difference and the power of a God narrative. And that's why it's so important in our lives that we, in our unique stories and in our families, that we will embrace the God narrative, because it has the power of life and death. And not only for us individually, but it has the power of life and death for generations to come after us. And I'm going to be pointing out the power of what happens when it comes to what's happening in families and the decisions that any given generation makes. The Bible speaks of blessings and curses. And the Bible, when the scriptures speak of it, the Bible speaks of it in terms of a generational blessing or a generational curse. When we think of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then after that, Joseph, we see what is a progression of a godly heritage. One generation to another, to another, to another. I want you to know that's not just by chance. The Bible says that there was a covenant promise that was given to Abraham, and that out of his seed, the nations would be blessed. And we see that this is something that's going to be a blessing that will go far beyond Abraham's generation and far beyond himself. And sure enough, here comes Isaac's generation, and the blessing is there. And we see that here comes Jacob's generation. We see the blessing of God and God all over that story. And then we see Joseph in the same thing. And so, again, it's not by happenstance or by chance. Instead, it's a proactive blessing of God, that because God saw the decisions that Abraham made, he blessed him and blessed the generations that were to come. We see generational blessing. I can think of a story out of our lives, my family, that speaks to, it's a simple story, but it's a generational blessing. And that is that we moved from the Lorton area on over to Fairfax. And when we moved to Fairfax, it meant that our girls were going to be going to different schools than where they had gone in the Springfield area there. And so, and we knew that Aubrey and Taylor, our 2 oldest, had been able to go through 8th grade in a Christian school, and that's where we saw them learning so much scripture and really having so many things built into them through that school called Emmanuel Christian in Springfield. But when we moved, we knew that the whole plan was Aubrey would go to Fairfax High School, a public high school, very different school. And then Taylor, we were looking at her going there. But we wanted Sydney to be able to go through at least 8th grade like her sisters do, in getting that type of foundation in her life. So we walked in to see the headmaster. And when we went to see the headmaster, I'll never forget, Lisa and I walked into the office and I saw on the wall that was there that he had his diplomas up from Wheaton College. Do we have anybody that went to Wheaton by chance here? Anybody? It's a good Christian school, really good school. Billy Graham went there. Got to be good. And so I saw this, and I'm doing the whole thing of just making small talk, because we're about to be seated. We haven't met him before. And so we're sitting down, and I said, "Hey, you're a Wheaton grad." "Yes, I am." And I said, "That is a great school." And they, they have the C.S. Lewis collection there. C.S. Lewis's desk. Somebody else get excited about that. Where he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and the wardrobe is there that inspired him to write it. I got inside the wardrobe, not supposed to do that. I did. And I was looking for the back. I really was in there, but and then Tolkien's desk is there. And they've got some unique collections. And I was talking to him about this. And then I said, and they have the Billy Graham Center there. And of course, he knows all this. But, and I said, I love the Billy Graham Center. And some of my dad's things are there because my dad was an evangelist. Some of his scrapbooks and photos and the signs that they used for some of his meetings are there in the Billy Graham Center. And he was listening very intently with it all. And then we started to talk about Sydney and being able to go to the school there. That was our purpose of the meeting. And he looked up at us and said, "Wait, I see in this paperwork here that you have 3 daughters." I said, "Yes." Sydney has 2 older daughters. Sisters. That's a life story that couldn't be explained, but I said 2 older sisters. And he said, "Well, why aren't they here at this school?" And I said, "You want me to be direct with you?" And he said, "Sure." I said, "We can't afford it. It's too expensive to have all 3 girls at the school. So we're looking at public school over at Fairfax High School." And so we talked some more through it all. And then at one point he said, "I want to know what I need to do to get all 3 girls at my school." And he said, "If I were to give you 55% off, would you send all 3 girls here?" Well, at that point, it's barely more than one person coming. And Lisa starts crying. And he gets the tissue, and she's over there, and I'm pinching her good to cry more because, And then he said, "I want to do this. I have a special account that only I have as the headmaster, and I have not given my scholarship out yet." And he said, "This is my scholarship, and I want to give it to your family." And when we were walking out, I thought to myself, "Dad, I want to thank you. I never got to know you. You're in heaven. But the spiritual heritage just touched your granddaughters that you never got to meet." Generational blessing. We also know the opposite can be there. Some of us have come up through families, perhaps, that are generational in regard to dysfunction. Alcoholism maybe has marked your family and been devastating, perhaps, in your family. Maybe that's your story. Broken relationships and divorce and other things might be something that hurt and left a sense of brokenness at a season in your family. Whatever it may be, you may say, "Yeah, if I'm to be vulnerable and honest, that's my story." Those things are there. I want you to know that there are people in this room right now who decided to stand up and say, "I will be the generation that breaks all of these things that the enemy's tried to do to destroy. And I will be the first to stand up and say, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And we're going to do this thing in a way that brings healing and wholeness down the road, no matter how the enemy has tried to kick the air out of me." You have that power. Maybe your story is not a story of spiritual heritage of generations. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You have the power to be the very first in your story to bring that to that place. But there's in the scriptures, we see 640 times that blessings are talked about in the scriptures. So it's something that's very real and that we should study and recognize that God wants to bring blessing, and he wants to break the cycle of dysfunction that can be in a family. James Thurber said these words. He said, all men, and I would include women, all men must learn before they die what they are running from and to and why. It's pretty powerful. The key is not to run from your story. The key is to unlock the meaning of your story with the God narrative. To find out what it is that God is saying. Too many people are trying to run away from their story, but God has something better for you than running away from it. And he wants you to capture what is called a self story. The self story speaks to the fact that not everything makes the cut in our stories. There's a lot in our lives, and we don't take all of it and give it to somebody when we tell somebody about ourselves. We end up taking this, and then we take this, and maybe this, and then we bring it into what we call a self story. Well, what causes you to choose those things? And what causes you not to choose other things? So it speaks to the self story. And there are individuals that have a self story, and they have decided within their self story that they're going to avoid the lows. They're going to try their best to say they weren't there, or to ignore them, or to cover them up. But the reality is that the power of our testimony is saying, I was broken there. And it isn't in spite of that God has used me. It's because of that God has used me. And now I've got a testimony of how when I was weak, he was made strong. So listen to the Apostle Paul when he says, I'm the chief of all sinners. Not good on your resume. Put it out there. People are a little wary of you because you've got a past. But the reality is, Paul the Apostle takes that terminology and says, I'm the chief of all sinners, but because he's framing it within the idea of God's grace. That I, as a chief of sinners, that I had something to do with the deaths of the believers and followers of Jesus Christ. And I'm not going to cover that up. I'm going to let it be known that that's where I'm weak, and because I'm weak, he is made strong. So there's the power of it, but too many of us hide it. It's called family secrets. And we want people not to see that. So we put the best image we can on things, and when we do that, we are capturing a counterfeit story to what God wants us truly to be able to have, which is a God story. And instead of taking that counterfeit story of, oh, it didn't happen, we don't talk about it, we just act like it didn't happen and we're bigger than that. The reality is sometimes we've got to fall off our throne in order to understand the grace of God. And sometimes we've got to recognize that we've gone through some low points, and that God has a narrative in that to show us, again, he's not using us in spite of it. He didn't do it to us. The Bible says that God does not purposely harm the sons of men. In other words, God is so often accused by us of being the one who did something to us. How many times have we said, where is God? Why didn't God do this? Why God did? It's an act of nature. Tornadoes came through and destroyed. It's an act of God. Listen, the Bible says there is one that comes to kill, steal, and destroy, but it's not God. And Jesus was sent to give us abundant life, the God kind of life, wholeness. Now we've got to capture that God narrative until we no longer blame God and instead recognize that there's an enemy, but it isn't God, and I'm going to declare the narrative of God over my life and to others as I share my story. What we're really doing in all of that is we are capturing what's called the Imago Dei. Imago Dei actually simply means the image of God. So what you're doing is you are dusting off the Imago Dei. You are digging deeper in instead of the surface thing of put on a good face and say everything's great. You're digging in deeper to be able to say that I am uncovering the Imago Dei, the image of God, as he is writing a story in and through my life, and it's his story, and he's writing it in my life, and that is the Imago Dei, and I'm not going to stop until I found out what is that story that you're writing, God. Not the story of they're so big and the land devours the people in it, not that story, but the story that says that God is writing in your life and bringing you to a place of wholeness and giving you victory where the enemy tried to defeat you. Can I hear an amen on that? Genesis 37:2. Bible says this is the account of Jacob's family line. And then the next sentence starts with the word Joseph. This is the account of Jacob's family line, Joseph. And after you read that and you read on, you find out it's all about Joseph. Jacob becomes a bit player at that point. And yet it's the story of Jacob, his family line. Yet it's all about Joseph. What is that telling us? The Bible, again, places an emphasis upon family. Joseph's story could not be told outside of the link to his family. And we see that in Genesis. That's the power of it. And the Bible will show us that even though our interpretation of family today, if I were to say, tell me about your family, immediately your thought is my immediate family. And that would be what you would tell me about is your immediate family, whatever that may be. But the Bible speaks of family in terms of 3 and 4 generations. This means the decisions that your great-grandparents made may very well be affecting you today. And the decisions that your grandparents made and your parents made may be affecting you more than you know. And it's a generational thing. And we need to stop and identify that for a moment to see that a family is generations. Now, let me say this to you. Decisions that you make in your generation, this brings it right to your front door right now. Here it is for you. Make it practical, Pastor. Here it is. Decisions you make may affect your kids, should God give you kids. May affect your grandchildren someday, may affect your great-grandchildren someday. The decisions that you make have the power of life and death. We've already looked at that. And it's so vital that we make the right decisions. Christina, as a family, Christina Baldwin, in her book Storycatcher that I've read many times for my thesis, she said, over time, we can see how the life choices of our ancestors impacted the family and how individuals in each succeeding generation made choices that accentuated or counterbalanced what happened before. I want for my team in the back to get ready and for Heather to get ready to show a video to you. Just by a show of hands, how many of you were able to see some or all of the last season of American Idol? By a show of hands, anybody? It's amazing. I can see why it's their last season. Well, American Idol made some household names out of some people, and Kelly Clarkson was one of those individuals. She sang a song in the last season, and it was a song that she wrote. And this song is autobiographical. I want you to see the song as we play it in just a moment and see it through the eyes of a story catcher. Because remember, I'm calling upon you all to capture story, to be story catchers, to really get to know somebody by their story. When Kelly Clarkson wrote this song, she wrote about, and you'll hear as she begins to sing it, it's about her dad. And you'll hear within it that it kind of takes a shift to be about her husband, and then it takes a shift to be about her daughter. It's as if she's walking us through the defining moments of her personal story And you'll hear a narrative that she takes out of it, all in a simple song that she wrote out of her own life. And then I'll share my life story with you. Listen to this. Anybody need any tissue? How many feel like they know Kelly Clarkson better? Just from watching that one song of highs and lows and a narrative that she embraced out of that. She could have embraced a narrative that just was opposite and went to the bitter side, but she chose a narrative that made her better instead. When I think of life story, I think of the highs and the lows and the narrative that we can extract from that. And the narrative actually is a question that I want to ask you. What is it that you've been through that you can ride to greater wisdom? If you've been through it, what's the takeaway? If you've been through it, what was God saying? And what is he saying to you now? Because to live through our lives, to go through our lives without capturing the God story is to leave us simply broken and empty. Back years ago, I told what year, but it ages me. I was born in Los Angeles, California. And if I were to write it out on a graph for you, I would write the word high, as I did last week in regard to the life of Joseph in the scriptures. And I would write high, and I would say that I was born into a family of godly heritage, and that is the high of the early point of my life. God gave me amazing parents. And my father was a 6th generation. Now I'm 7th generation preacher, unbroken preachers, unbroken line. That means my dad, my granddad, my great-granddad, my great-great-granddad. Don't ask me what they did. I already told you. They were preachers. And that's a godly heritage. I think of my granddad, Los Angeles Magazine called him the first of the great radio preachers out of Los Angeles. He had a high-powered station there, and he reached all the people of Southern California with his radio broadcasts. In those days, you only had 2-3 places to listen. He carried a lot of power in that. He reformed the city, almost reformed it. And he would preach Christ and regeneration, but he also was getting in there and breaking up things he needed to break up and calling out names of mayors and chief of police of Los Angeles that ended up going to the penitentiary because he exposed them for underworld things. And there are those who believe that it's because of my grandfather. They called him Fighting Bob Schuller for a reason, Fighting Bob. There's a reason why there are those that say that the gambling racket that's in Las Vegas would have been in Los Angeles were it not for Granddad running them out. There are those who say that Al Capone ended up assigning Babyface Nelson, for those of you that know any history, to wipe out Bob Schuller. And Billy Graham, when he was a young minister and not a known name, would come out to my granddad's church to be able to spend time with Fighting Bob Schuller and to be able to be mentored in the launching of his career at that time with his great Los Angeles crusade. His church was bombed twice, but he wasn't there either time. But it did damage to the church. The Schuller Ranch in El Monte, California was machine gun riddled or shot at. My uncle took a bullet, I understand, in the hand. These are all stories that come down. It was the time of, again, the gambling, the Al Capone, all the prohibition, all of that. Granddad was at the height of what he was doing in Los Angeles. My father grew up not wanting to have anything to do with all of that and the ministry side of things. He loved his dad, but he wanted to be a movie star, and he was looked at by the top movie studios, and he was offered a long-term contract. MGM, Warner Brothers were all interested in my father. But my granddad sent him off to Bob Jones University. My dad didn't know what Bob Jones University was. All he knew was he was going there to get theatrical training because granddad didn't want him to go to Hollywood. He sent him to Bob Jones and paid for a year of theatrical training. Well, they had a little theatrical group, but they were not the place you would send somebody for theatrical training. Dad didn't know. And when Dad was there, he was in a play because he's going to be there for a year. So he gets in a play and he plays the part of Barabbas. And when he's in the play playing the part of Barabbas, he's looking at a cross that they had built and they had there on the stage. And he has his audience that's listening. And he's saying, I'm the one that should be on that cross. My sins are what place somebody on a cross. You've never sinned. And you're dying for me. I still have that script. And it's aged and his markings are on it. Well, as he's kneeling at the cross and he's crying out, that cross belongs to me. I'm the one who should die there. Tears are running down his face and people are saying, this guy is a born actor, but he wasn't acting and he gave his heart to Christ right there. He went through the neighborhood around there, Bob Jones University, and he knocked on doors. He got 20 people or so to come out to hear his very first sermon, and 4 got saved, and it started him on a trajectory to where he ended up being second only to Billy Graham in the size and the impact of his ministry in the 1940s and 1950s. He would hold meetings in large stadiums, civic auditoriums, tent meetings, and he and Billy Graham shared a massive tent. I wish I had even a piece of the fabric of it to frame in my home. And Dad was the one who brought John Ashcroft to Christ, former Attorney General. I could name the ones that he had such a profound impact. They attribute 1 million people coming to Jesus through his ministry. And yet, amidst all of that, and there's something else to say that goes to the low point, but don't let me get there yet because I want to talk about my mom for a second. My mom worked for Bob Pierce of World Vision. She was his executive assistant. She worked for Billy Graham and put all of the team of people together to help with his New York City, Madison Square Garden, 1957 crusade, the biggest one of his career. And she hired all the people for the crusade office, came in a year beforehand and didn't leave till long afterwards because she was creating all of this to be the structure for Graham and his team to come in. And again, like I say, it turned New York City upside down. Times Square, that street, completely shut down. Nobody's going anywhere. It's packed with people hearing the gospel. And then he was also in the stadium there in Madison Square Garden as well. And my mom, after my dad's death, she was Catherine Kuhlman's assistant for 2 years. And there's a lot of spiritual heritage that's there in the midst of all that. But more than anything else, my mom's the one who led me to Jesus. She prayed the sinner's prayer with me when I was young. She's had the greatest impact on my young life. I've never seen anybody who loves the Lord more, was more dedicated. That's the high where I'm writing it for you is the spiritual heritage of my family. But at the same time, there was a low to it all that not everybody would be fully aware. And that is that my mom and my brother and I were the second family to my dad, of my dad's. Because in those days, there was so much upon a handful of ones that were evangelists crisscrossing the nation. They would be in meetings that they would have set up for 2 weeks, but then they'd get a week or two to come home before they'd go off to another and another and another. And the whole idea was you've got to get people saved. There's this movement of God that is happening right now that is an unusual wave, and it was. And only a handful of individuals were having these types of meetings to be able to just bring the souls in mass. The challenge is that as the Spirit of God was moving, there would be the plea to stay a week more, stay 2 weeks more. And more people would get saved, and it'd be less and less time with the family. And before you knew it, his family just fell apart. And my mom is the second wife, and there was a divorce and a remarriage there. And I can tell you that with a divorce and a remarriage that the religious spirit kicks up big time. And believe me, I understand what the scriptures have to say on different things, but I'm going to bring it to the narrative so you'll understand what this means to me. People abandoned him. I found some letters not that long ago, and I read a letter by R.G. Lee. Some of you may know who he is. He was a great Baptist preacher out of Memphis, Tennessee, had a huge church there. And I saw him reach out to my dad with love. And I have letters from other very well known, I could name their names and you would know them, who reached out to my dad with judgment. Alone, that's it. And they bury you. The narrative that I received out of all of that was the narrative of, you know what? God is a God of grace. And what others discard on the side of the road, God delights in picking up and using and showing how he can redeem. God is always redemptive. And a religious spirit will play right into the enemy's plan to hold somebody to the place of brokenness and emptiness and tell them it ends there. And I refuse to do that. And so I learned something in the narrative, and that was to be sensitive to people that are going through things. The least thing they need is for you to preach at them when they're hurting. The thing they need most is the love of God and to love people through difficult times. It doesn't take away from God's hatred of divorce or whatever we may want to talk about in that regard. But it taught me that the love of God will reach people much better than the judgment of man. Were I to move on with what I'm looking at in my life's narrative, there was a time where I was working at Robert Schuller's church, Crystal Cathedral, out in Orange County, California, in Garden Grove, and I was the elevator operator, which was a big deal because I wore a uniform to do it, and I met all the guests that would come to be on television and be interviewed. And I met presidents that way, and I met sports heroes and movie stars that were coming to be interviewed about their faith, and it was a fun job to have. And one day, a person by the name of Oral Roberts showed up, and he was the guest that day, and a preacher, a healing evangelist. And he came on the elevator with his wife, Evelyn, and I noticed he took a particular interest in me being the elevator operator there, and asked me my name, and I talked to him a little bit, and then he said, are you going to come to my school? And I said, what? And he said, are you going to come to my school? I said, sir, I watch your school on television. I've seen the show. And I think it's beautiful. It's a beautiful campus. And he said, I want you to come to my school. And I did. And I came to Oral Roberts University, and it was there at Oral Roberts University in my freshman year that I received a call from God into full-time ministry. It is undeniable. It was a powerful call at a retreat that I was on with the school. And it was at ORU that I met Lisa. And then we got married during those years when I was at ORU. And I still remember her going around with her engagement ring to people she didn't know and putting it in their face. And those days, and I could share so much from the stories from back in those days. And it was at that time that we were building up our family. And 2 out of 3 of our girls were dedicated on the ORU stage right there in chapel. And Sydney wanted to make sure last Sunday when she found out I was going to tell my highs and lows, she said, Dad better name me as a high next week. So I am. Without question, you're a high. You're not a low. And that was a time where it was just wonderful in so many ways. And I was launched into ministry during those years. And I had a music ministries team that went with me the first summer. And I went out on missions and got to understand God and his heart for the world all through Oral Roberts University. Those would be the things that I would mark as high, but I'm going to tell the low of that as well. And on the low side of it, there came a time where there was a shift in things at the university, and a shift in the decisions that were being made at the very top of the university structure. And let me say within this, that was a season. Those leaders have now moved on, and I don't hold them or label them with that in the sense that I believe God is doing an ongoing work. But I'm taking you back to a snapshot in time. ORU is a great place. They're thriving. I'm on the board of reference, okay? So it's all good there. But taking you back to this snapshot in time, the changes that were taking place were really bringing a sense of dysfunction. And I was the chaplain and dean of spiritual formation. So when I saw some of the things that were coming forward that were not right spiritually, I was grieved in that. And there were individuals that were coming to me and faculty and staff that were needing a pastor through some of those things. And before long, the writing was on the wall. Our time was done. Now, what I knew at that university was it had shaped me in so many ways, significant ways. I just mentioned them. I mean, I found my calling, my wife, my children, all of this, everything was right there at this place. And it was my first job, and it was the paycheck that I depended on, and it was all of these things. And to know that that era would be so difficult an ending was very, very hard to go through. And the narrative of that time was to, again, recognize something. And I honestly, this is the narrative I had through it, and it was like a revelation that I was to count it all joy when I go through these difficult trials. I want to say to you, this is true, if you had come up to me at that moment and said the narrative is count it all joy, I would have slapped you, because there was nothing joyful about it. The feeling was there that it was just wrong, and it was the enemy had his fingerprints all over it, is what it would look like, and the air was knocked out of my family and I. But in time, I saw that if I knew what I know now, I would have invited everybody to a party and we would have celebrated. Somebody called me and I didn't know him. It's right at the time where my last days on the campus were happening. But nobody knew that they were my last days other than my wife and I and our family, we knew. And Earl McClellan, some of you will remember him from Men's Retreat when he came, and he's one of our overseers for the church. He was on my staff at the time. And he was my men's chaplain. He came in with the phone. He said, Pastor, you need to take this call. I said, Earl, you know what things are like right now. I can't take that call. And Earl was aware. And he said, Pastor, you need to take the call. So I took it. The least thing I wanted to do at that moment with what I was feeling was be on the phone. And I said, hello, this is Bill Schuler. And the person on the other end said, Pastor Bill, you don't know me. I've been watching your ministry for quite some time. I've been seated there each time you preach, and you've blessed me, and you've blessed my family. He said, Pastor, you're not going to be at the university much longer. And he said, I'll tell you why. Because you're some of God's finest china, and he doesn't want you broken. And you'd be broken if you stayed. He's releasing you. I said, hold on just a second. My wife just walked through the door. Tell her what you just told me. Lisa took the phone. When she took the phone, she started to say, yes, because, and I said, he doesn't know. He doesn't know. She looks at me, he doesn't know? Mm-mm. We went out to lunch with this individual who was a protege of Miles Monroe. That'll mean something to some people, maybe not others, but and Miles just went to be with the Lord and had an outstanding ministry, you know where you am. And he had a piece of paper there, and he began to outline in this lunch. And to this day, I can't tell you his name. I'm not kidding. It's pretty dumb. I should have gotten it. And he started writing, and he said, you're going to go someplace where you're going to deeply affect leadership and the leadership of our nation and the things that are happening in our nation. And it's like he was just speaking forth things that we see manifest before our eyes today. That was the low of it, and the narrative out of that was the joy that we should embrace because God never dropped us. I went through survival mode. I saw my girls coming down the steps and I had tears in my eyes because I didn't know how to tell them that I didn't know whether we could stay in the house anymore or whether we would own the car beyond a week or two. I didn't know how we were going to be taken care of. And I call that survival mode, and some of you might completely identify with that in your story. But then we got to a place where it isn't about survival, it's about success, meaning I was gonna do Christian success seminars similar to like a Peter Lowe. Some of you may know that name from back in the past. And I had a lot of friends that could have really helped make these things happen. And we'd bring in speakers, they'd share their testimonies. We'd get people saved in a more secular format. And I wrote out all of that, but that wasn't it. It wasn't survival mode. It wasn't success mode. It was absolute, God, you've got me. You can take me anywhere you want to use me. You can take my family anywhere. You've got me. I don't have it in my own strength anymore. And that's when God at 3 a.m. awakened me and said, we're going to Washington, D.C. to start a ministry. And that's the high. And that is, you're the high. I launched Capital Life Church. God opened the doors of the White House right away for Bible studies every week that we were leading for 7 years. There, so many things that would take place. We had a prayer center down at 2nd and Penn, Southeast, and right near the Library of Congress building. So many things, and it launched to where we see where we're at today. God didn't drop you. It's time to get the God narrative in it and see that he loves to be the one that takes the stone that the builder rejected, and he loves to use that stone as the cornerstone. I don't know why God uses me. I don't know why. I'm not trying to sound humble here. I have half brothers that I can say he's got the gifting in this, and he's got the gifting, and all I have are the best looks, but no. There's a brother I'd actually say had the best looks. And yet, within all of that, why? Why would he use what others would have said is finished? Then that whole idea of count it all joy, because it leads you somewhere. It leads you to a place of maturity in the things of God. It leads you to the Imago Dei. It leads you to the image of God being so brushed off until you begin to sense, I'm in the story with God, and his larger story is guiding me. And I have absolute knowing that I was born for such a time as this, and that no weapon formed against me shall prosper. And I speak that over your life. You were born for such a time as this. No weapon formed against you will prosper, even religious weapons. And I'm talking about a religious spirit. It's time for us to be authentic and life-giving. It's time for us to know each other's stories. It's time to be story catchers.